Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it's great to see we have actually got one or two new members with us this afternoon and a really good attendance. I think you're in for an entertaining afternoon on well, it's a surprisingly wide subject, actually, of how many ways in which the mail was affected in France. Paul is a fellow member of the Thames Valley region of the Royal. He's a leading member of the France and Colonies Society and a member of the Society of Postal Historians. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending this afternoon. I'm going to show and discuss some covers that illustrate the effects of the German invasion of France in June 1940 to end of 44. It's a vast topic. This is only scratching the surface of it, but I hope you get an impression from what I show you this afternoon of what was going on and that you find something of interest. The welcome screen there shows a map of the German forces moving into France from the north and the northeast, and some of the implications of that are noted on the text there. The key thing to note is that it was a fast, very confusing, and the armistice between the French and German governments was put together very quickly before the end of June, and that effectively split France in two. The German forces were too thin on the ground to make a full occupation practical, so they did in fact split the country and set up a puppet government in Vichy under Marshal Pétain. That was, as a puppet government implies, it was responsible entirely to Germany and danced to a German tune. Some covers. The French army in the north and northeast had been sitting on the border waiting for the German invasion since October 1939, so they weren't entirely unprepared, but they were unprepared for the ferocity and speed, and that affected the postal service to the army. A couple of items there addressed to the army in the beginning of June, just as the attack was taking place. Neither, of course, was deliverable. The top one was to a guy in Strasbourg, and that went back to its original writer because it couldn't be delivered. The second is slightly more interesting. A colonial regiment fighting again in the Ardennes in the east of France. And the guy to whom this was addressed was in the unit, which was, as the note says, it was involved in the final bayonet charge of the Battle for France against panzer tanks on the 21st of June, and the unit suffered 75% losses. That again, obviously wasn't forwarded. There was no postal service by the time that was in the delivery box. What happened very shortly afterwards was that the German army took prisoners of war, obviously, from the French, those who didn't escape, and they held them temporarily in what were known as Frontstalags. They were basically camps where sorting took place, and the Germans took stock of who they had. The topmost of those two covers is interesting in that it was addressed to a senior officer, General Roux, who, as the note says, commanded the 45th Infantry in Alsace. He was captured in June 1940, and he was held in, as you see it from the address there, the French officers' camp at Drancy. Drancy was a half-built housing estate outside Paris, brutalist buildings used to house French officers initially. Later in the war, slightly, or rather more offensive use as a transit camp for Jews en route to Auschwitz. The second of the two covers, again addressed to a French soldier at a Frontstalag. By the time this had reached him, had reached the camp, he had been transferred into the Stalag system, and he was in Stalag 12A, and that was actually forwarded. The general's letter never got to him. We don't know where he was placed, but the second one got to its destination. And it's got the Stalag sensor cache to endorse that. A couple more covers to French troops. Again, the first one addressed to a front Stalag and then transferred to Stalag 17B in Austria, German-occupied Austria, of course. That's quite interesting because it's got a sensor cache of the rump French army run by Vichy. It was totally subordinate to the German army, but it maintained the fiction of there being a French army in Vichy, France. I think perhaps censoring mail was about the most exciting thing they got up to. The second item is an early type of postcard to POWs. It's a French type, which was very quickly stopped. They're few and far between these because the Germans imposed their own type of postal stationery and didn't like the French model. That's gone into Stalag 2D. These are a more familiar type, French POWs in Germany in the Stalags camp system. These are formula cards produced by the German government, issued to prisoners, where they were fairly well controlled. The first item is from an officer's camp and off flag. It's a parcel receipt card, which is quite interesting, with the Unbesetztes Gebiet hand stamp, which is to help with the mail routing. Unbesetztes Gebiet is the unoccupied zone, so the mail could be directed in that part, as it were. The second of the two, it looks innocuous, but it's from a very interesting camp at Kopicin, just outside Krakow, Stalag 369, which was a punishment camp. The other ranks, as it were supposed by the Geneva Convention that they could be asked to work for the German government or for the German army, either in the camp itself or in a work commando which was assigned somewhere where there was a job to do. People who didn't cooperate were roughed up and sent off to Kopicin. So that's quite an interesting venue to get a card from. Not all soldiers, not all French soldiers were captured by the Germans. Those who were fighting in the southeast of France, for example, near the Swiss border, went across the border into Switzerland, neutral Switzerland, where they were not prisoners of war, of course, they were refugees from the French army, and the Swiss army set up camps or had camps set up ready for them, and they were treated as internees. They were there, quite a number, between, well, you see from the top there, 30,000, from the end of June, when things got hot in France, until January 1941. There was an agreement made between the German government, Vichy, and the Swiss army that these soldiers could be released back into France. There would be no blame attached to them. They could go about their lives and just become ordinary French citizens again. I don't know quite how far that went, but that was the theory. The first of the two is the scarcer of the two, in that it's a piece of mail into the camps. Tends not to have survived as well as mail coming from the camps, which is what the second item is. The second item also is from an officer in a colonial regiment. One of the interesting points about the 1941 agreement, where the French soldiers were allowed back into France, is that the Germans drew a line at colonial troops. French officers, yes, but the actual troops were not allowed back into France, and they spent their war in Switzerland. Again, not all the French army were captured or went into exile in Switzerland. Some got away to the UK, either with the British Expeditionary Force evacuation from Dunkirk or by other means, and they set up free French Army, Navy and Air Force bases in London for the duration of the war. Now, mail from France or from elsewhere, you see the bottom one is from Senegal, to members of the Free French Forces were addressed to an undercover PO box number in London, coded depending on which arm of the forces it was addressed to. The letters then went from the GPO in London to the Free French headquarters in London, and the location of the soldiers or servicemen was written on the cover front, and they were redirected. So you see, for example, the first item is to somebody, a civilian actually, with the French Navy in London. It's been opened. This is very unusual. It's been opened by the French Navy. You see on the left-hand side there the censor closing label of the FNFL, which is the Free French Navy. I guess they must have opened it because the addressee was a civilian rather than a member of the forces. Whatever he was doing, it passed. It went to, from box F10 and the GPO, it actually went to the French base, I think probably at Plymouth. We don't have a record of all the acronyms. CPL, possibly Plymouth. The second item from Senegal, there was a big Free French Forces presence in Senegal at the time, addressed to someone at PO Box 236 in London, which was the Free French Air Force, and it is recorded that IPDC was RAF Perranporth in Cornwall. So the guy was obviously serving with the RAF down in Cornwall during the war. Thinking aside from the forces, the German incursion into northeastern France caused absolute chaos amongst the civilians, of course. A lot of villages, a lot of buildings were destroyed, a lot of post offices were destroyed, and a lot of post office stock disappeared. So there is a period from June to August 1940 where some offices in the northeast didn't have stamps, didn't have hand stamps, didn't have staff or premises, and you get some emergency items from that period. The top one there is obviously a shortage of stamps. 25 centimes was 75 centimes short of a letter rate, and the 75 has been paid in cash with that boxed cachet from Toul. The lower of the two from Montciel, obviously they had nothing. They didn't have a date stamp, they didn't have stamps, they didn't have anything. So the Montciel straight line grief is being used as a authorization for postage paid in cash. Just two items from the scene of chaos. Further compounded by refugees. Obviously people in northeastern France, and indeed from Paris, flooded the roads trying to get away from the German forces advancing, but also a tremendous number of Belgians, estimated to be 2 million Belgians in France in mid-1940, escaping or running from the German army. And organizations were set up in France, despite all the chaos. Organizations were set up to put Belgian refugees in touch with each other, or to create a system whereby their whereabouts could be known. And these two postcards do just that. The lower of the two is the more interesting, perhaps. It's been sent via the Red Cross initially in Paris, and then the Red Cross in Antwerp, back to the addressee's family to let them know that he was still going strong, still alive. I mentioned earlier the partition of France. This was discussed and set up at the time of the armistice at the end of June in 1940. The map there gives a pretty good idea of how the country was split up. The yellow part of the map was the German occupation zone, of course. The red coastal area was the exclusion zone, where security was very tight, and the Vichy area is the blue coloured section of the map, the so-called free zone there, centred on Vichy. as you see in the north. There was no communication between the two zones for the first year, in fact. No telephone, no telegrams, no nothing, apart from a postcard system that was set up. It was postcards because postcards were quick to look at, to censor and to pass, rather than the cumbersome opening of envelopes that would have had to have taken place with letters. So it was just postcards. Formula postcards, as you see there, the first type, particularly prescriptive, you could only fill in the boxes. That eased off. May 1941, they issued a more straightforward type of postcard where there was just a space to write. There wasn't the control that there had been. The control over these cards was very strict, however. They had to be censored, in effect, by the postal staff of the office at which they were posted, or the office that was responsible for the area where they were posted, and they were collected, sent to Vichy or to Paris, depending on which of the two zones we're talking about. And then there was a daily exchange of mail at Moulins on the border between the two areas, 6 days a week. German van came down from Paris and picked up the mail and swapped it for mail from the other zone. So very, very strict compliance. See there from these two examples that ordinary mail, non-standard, non-formula postcards were not allowed. And two items, they're both from Paris, I think, with cachets, acheminement suspendu, or unadmis, the unadmis, particularly homemade, shall we say. But it just goes to show that the control of mail was rather harsh. These are examples of three cards from that system, all three disallowed because of some minor infringement, and all with their own individually made cachets, usually just returning to sender. They were called family cards or familiar cards because that was their purpose. They were designed to pass information between family members, but they had wider implications than that would imply, including being used to and from the French colonies. A couple of items here. One is the top one of the two is from Dakar in Senegal into France. And the second one is leaving France and going to the Côte d'Ivoire, Abidjan. I suppose it could be classed as family items, but there's slightly unusual usage. Very unusual usages illustrated with these two cards. The top item was actually posted from the Camp de Gour, which was one of the civilian internment camps in the southern half of France. It shouldn't have been available for use, in fact, in the camp, but somehow or other the writer got hold of one, and it was allowed anyway. There is a pencil mark around the cachet, cancelling the stamp indicium, as you can see, but nevertheless, I think it probably got to its destination. Whereas the second item was totally weird because it was used from a French address in Marseille into the OFLAG system. It was addressed to OFLAG 11B. It shouldn't have been used. It wasn't permissible to use these out of the country into a foreign country like Germany, let alone to a prisoner of war camp. However, that seems to have gone through because it's got a German transit cachet, a censor cachet on. There was also a system for conducting business. It wasn't business as normal, but there was a system based again on similar standard formula postcards where companies could actually send an order or information about an order to different types of card to a business partner in the other half of France. It was a very cumbersome system because it required the cards to be sent to the local chambers of commerce, who vetted the cards, and then they were sent to either Paris or Vichy, and the whole system went on from there as per the family cards. But it didn't make for speedy business, I'm sure. There was a restriction, obviously, on foreign mail. The top cover is particularly interesting in that it was an attempt to send a letter to Italy in mid-June, 7th of June. There it was posted, so mid-June it was in the postal system at a time when the Italian army, the Axis allies of Germany, were invading the south of France. This was in support of the German army. So there was a battle of Menton down in the southeast at the same sort of time as the armistice was being discussed in northern France. And this is an item which got caught up in the mail there. Obviously, it couldn't get through the fighting, so the thing was turned back by the military authorities. The second item is a bit more unusual, shall we say, because there was this ban on foreign mail. It was uncertain what to do with mail for Switzerland. Switzerland was always a special case, being a neutral country, and mail for Switzerland forms an interesting subsection of my collection, in fact. The post office didn't know what to do. Did we send mail to Switzerland or did we not? So they sent it to Paris for a decision. And the Paris Recette Centrale, the RC in the retour cachet, looked at it and decided, no, we don't send mail to Switzerland at the moment. So they cancelled the stamps with their cachet, the retour à l'envoyeur, and it was sent back. But it's a slightly unusual use of that cachet. I haven't seen it cancelling stamps before. UK letters into France. Obviously, if there was fighting going on, it was a problem to forward the mails. The top item there, posted on the 15th of June. Well, we know that there was a lot of chaos in northern France in the second half of June, and it didn't get any further than the London sorting office, in fact, when it was turned around and with the no service return to send the cachet. The second item, more interesting in that late 1940, it was perfectly permissible to send mail from the UK to the unoccupied zone, the Vichy France area, the south of France. Lots of English people still living in the south of France, lots of mail going in that direction from the UK. This is an item from Chichester to Perpignan in the south. That was okay, it got to Perpignan, but then somebody at Perpignan redirected it to Paris, and that of course was in the occupied northern zone, and there was no communication, so it was turned around and sent back to the UK. That's an unusual item. Some mail, which was in transit at the time of the German invasion, early to mid-June in 1940, found its way into the cellars of the Paris Recette Principale. And it was just kept for the duration of the war. It tends to be usually items with semi-valuable content. The top one, obviously, shipping documents only, wasn't particularly of interest. The second one contained a check for £1, which was a year's subscription to the Times back in those days. I still have the check. It never got cashed. I don't know what it'd be worth today. But the mail was held in sacks in the cellars of the Central Post Office, and then in April 1945 they were fished out and delivered to the London GPO. 150 sacks of these letters, totally, well, probably mostly totally irrelevant 5 years later, but nevertheless the post office proved a point. Mail to French colonies was difficult, depending on the colony, depending on its allegiance with Vichy France, which changed during the war as the Free French gained a foothold in the colonies. This item, 1941, posted to Cochinchine, or what we now know as Vietnam, and it went the transatlantic route, which is perfectly normal, flown across from France to New York, across to San Francisco, across the Pacific, and into Indochina or Cochinchina. The timing was bad for this item. By the time it reached San Francisco, the Japanese had done their worst at Pearl Harbor the day before. And on the day that it reached San Francisco, the US declared war on Japan. So this item was certainly not going across the Pacific, and it was sent back to France from the USA. Unusual item. Coming the other direction, mail from the USA into France. Again, as with the British item a couple of slides ago, perfectly okay to send mail into the south of France, but not okay to send mail to Paris. And this has come in through New York, Lisbon route into Marseille, and Marseille couldn't forward it north to Paris, so it had to turn it back. The little 3-line violet cachet is the Marseille cachet, and the big 2-line return to sender is back at New York. One method of getting mail through is the well-known Thomas Cook, the travel agent's undercover mail box, PO Box 506 system. A couple of examples here which use that system to get to addressees in the UK, or at least one of them is the UK. The first is an ambulance envelope, the envelope that carried the letter to the Thomas Cook offices in Lisbon, just PO Box 506 Lisbon. The letter inside would have been removed when it reached London, and it would have been put into the post. The second is slightly less usual, perhaps, in that it was posted from France. The stamp is the 250 stamp, which paid the foreign letter rate, posted to Lisbon. The office at Lisbon forwarded it to London, and in London, the address was covered up with this yellow label, Thomas Cook yellow label, and readdressed to this lady in Wales. Another well-known method of communication was the Red Cross message scheme. Ubiquitous, run throughout the war, thousands of the things. This is a bog standard item between France and the UK. It's gone through the German Red Cross office in Paris, and then across to London. It's nice because it's got its original envelope, but other than that, this is one of many hundreds of thousands that were posted during the war. These are a bit more unusual. The Red Cross also, of course, operated from Vichy and from Dakar in Senegal, indeed. And these two items, the left-hand one is a Red Cross message form from Vichy into Dakar, and the right-hand one is the reverse. You can see the way that the different postal systems treated these items. The first went into an envelope and was addressed and went to its destination. The one coming into France from Dakar was folded in 3, stuck together with a bit of tape and a stamp put on it. So it was not using up valuable paper in using an envelope, I guess. Less common than the Red Cross is the Vatican Message Service system. Little known about it, comparatively little known about it. It was in use the latter part of the war, sort of 1943, 44, and just afterwards, in fact. And it was as it says on the tin, it was a system operated by the Vatican, by the Catholic Church. The white example is from Italy, so from the Vatican itself into Paris. looking for news of the writer's son. And the red one, slightly more unusual again, is from the Vatican office in Algiers, North Africa, from Senegal back to Lyon, asking for information via Senegal via Algiers, of course. Civilians in France during the war, civilian enemy, civilian aliens, as they were labeled, could be held in internment camps. Most of these were in the unoccupied zone in the south of France. Two examples there. They were generally, well, the French call them undesirables. They housed undesirables. Undesirables, the name could cover vagrant, as I say, vagrants, homosexuals, gypsies, communists, political troublemakers, and eventually Jews. A couple of items there from 1941 too. The first is the Camp de Gore, a Jewish internee writing to a contact in San Francisco. I don't have the letter, perhaps just as well, but an interesting transatlantic item from a Jewish internee there. And the lower of the two, the Camp de Rivesaltes into Switzerland, again in the same sort of area. This was a camp you really didn't want to get involved with. It was run by the French police, and it was quite an unpleasant place to be interned, I believe. British and American civilians, British first, and then when the USA joined the war, American civilians who were living in France were gathered together, particularly in the north initially, and they were put into internment camps where the German army could keep an eye on them. These two items are from the two largest camps. There were single-sex camps. The top item is from the camp out just outside Paris in the barracks of Saint-Denis. A huge number of British men and later American men, and probably the odd Australian, who knows, housed in the barracks. That's an item back to the UK. You see that the format is very similar to the Stalag system stationary. The lower of the two is from the women's camp at Vittel, whereas the men's camp was a barracks, an ex-barracks. The women's camp was a group of hotels in the spa town of Vittel. Germans just commandeered the hotels and put a barbed wire fence around them, and housed ladies there, including wonderful phrase, alien nuns. So any nuns in French convents who were originally from the UK or USA were put in this camp, along with the rest of the expat ladies. British servicemen who hadn't escaped from France, who hadn't gone through Dunkirk, who had gone south in trying to save themselves, air crew that had crashed or bailed out, bit of a ragtag group known as Detachment W, gravitated towards Marseille initially, looked after by a very fearsome Scottish priest who ran the Seamen's mission in Marseille, and they lived a fairly relaxed lifestyle for quite some time. They were allowed to wander about and sort of had a bit of money, and they could just live life down in Marseille until the Germans got wind of it, and they insisted that they were interned. And they were interned in a whole series of camps. Vichy France wasn't very keen on holding prisoners of war. They thought they weren't responsible for them. And they went through a series of camps of increasing security, because this group was a group of adventurers, basically, and they made a game of trying to escape. You see from the top one, the Sergeant Mosley cover, but he was one of 300 initially who were held in Saint-Hippolyte-du-Fort, November 41. 6 or 8 months later, the group of 300 had shrunk to 239, largely because of escapees. Interesting pair of covers. German manpower. Germany obviously needed considerable manpower to run its infrastructure, to run its industries, to keep the army supplied with munitions and metals and transport and all the rest of it. And the German government decided to order France to supply labor, basically. Prime Minister Laval, seen there in the Punch cartoon, dressed it up as a patriotic volunteer system. He tried to recruit Frenchmen to go to Germany in exchange for the release of French prisoners of war. For every 6 Frenchmen, 2 prisoners of war would be released. Voluntary scheme. Didn't take off. It wasn't very popular, as you can imagine. So eventually it became conscription, as the German demands for labor increased and the French government, the Vichy government, couldn't supply this. They started quite harsh recruitment. French workers in Germany, huge numbers. Some of them were housed in just workers' barracks. That cover is an example of an item to one of the Berlin barracks. There were, as you see from the bottom there, 3,000 camps in the city. A camp could be a few huts on a piece of open ground, or it could be a massive barrack type camp. It varied tremendously, but there were a lot of people held in these camps, sort of voluntarily. Certainly the Westarbeiter, the French, were paid for the work. It wasn't slave labor. They were paid usually the going rate. They had a reasonable amount of freedom and leisure. But as the cover there illustrates, they were on call for any kind of construction or factory work or anything really that was required in the city. The big industries around the country, around Germany, that needed particular labor. There are some examples here. The 2 obvious ones. One is from the Wattenstedt camp, which was the huge Hermann Goering steel works, which operated 24/7. Producing steel for the war effort, and that's an item to someone who was housed in one of the accommodation camps at the factory, at that steelworks. And the lower one is to a lady who was employed at the Nobel Dynamite Works, which was make munitions for the army. You'll see that both of them were sent express, one of them registered express. People had the idea that if they used these secure methods of postage, that the item would get there quickly, which was not true because of the palaver of going for censorship. The AE caches, the Frankfurt censor office, which was the route that this mail took, Lyon to Frankfurt. And speedy, well, no, it wouldn't have been speedy, but the post office would probably take a little bit more care of an express or registered item than it would of an ordinary letter. Anyway, this group of letters is very often seen with express or registered labels. I must say that the lower one is unusual in that it's addressed to a lady. Women were generally exempt from the recruitment for STO, for the compulsory labour, with the exception of unmarried ladies. Clearly this was a married lady, or ladies who didn't have families to look after. Very sexist. They are thin on the ground. I've got 3 examples, I think, of mail to ladies who were conscripted with the STO. 2 more examples to show the variety of placements, if you like. The top one is to a guy who was housed in a barrack camp at Gudenhaven, which is Gdynia in Poland, and this was, as you see, a deep water dockyard which specialised in servicing submarines, so a very important part of the German war effort, and he was living on site to do that. Whereas the second item is from a worker who was employed by a family-owned luxury fountain pen factory at the back of their house. Still there, in fact, or at least the outbuildings are still there. Seen them on Google. But it just shows the extremes. From the one hand, you've got somebody who is actually contributing to the German war effort, and on the other, just something which is fairly flippant, I suppose. Luxury fountain pens. Operation Torch. In November 1942, the British, American, and Free French armies invaded Algeria, northern Africa, caused panic amongst the German government in France, because obviously they were pretty close to the coast of southern France. So the decision was taken to invade all of France. The Vichy area was taken over by the German army, and the entire country was occupied from then on, from November 1942 onwards. These two items were letters addressed at that moment in time, November 1942, to French colonies in Africa. Obviously, they couldn't go any longer. The route had been between Marseille and Algiers, the air route, and that was now knocked out, so mail couldn't be sent. Again, you've got what we saw back in 1940, in fact, an interesting and imaginative mix of homemade cachets, particularly the lower one. As the Germans had occupied the hitherto free zone in France, mail from the UK, which had been quite steady to the south of France during the war, no longer was possible. So there's an item there which is addressed to Cap Ferrat in the Alpes-Maritimes, and that was turned around in London and sent back to Chester. It couldn't be forwarded because the Germans had now invaded the south of France. This is a very interesting item. The Allied invasion of Corsica, October 1943, the Germans had as part of their invasion of the south of France, had also taken possession of Corsica. It had been held by Italian soldiers on the behalf of the Axis, but after the Italian surrender, the Germans felt they had to move into Corsica as well to secure it. And they took over the island and imprisoned the Italian garrison there. Shortly after that, the Allied forces landed in Corsica, from Sicily to Corsica, and there was fierce fighting. They released the Italian prisoners who fought on the Allied side, and were joined gleefully by the ragamuffin band of Corsican bandits who were part of the underground movement on the island, took over the island from the Germans. Somebody in Stoke-on-Trent was very hopeful that they could send a letter to a friend on Corsica 2 weeks after the island was taken, and several months before the actual post office got up and ran again in Corsica. And obviously that didn't get terribly far. It went as far as London and then was turned around. But very unusual item into Corsica itself, or an attempt to get an item to Corsica. This one is one of my favorite covers, showing this afternoon. Entirely dependent on the date in the postmark for discovering what it is. It's an item which was posted, as you see on the map there, from Le Havre on the right of the Bay de Seine to Valognes on the left of the Baie de Seine, just a day or two before the Allied landings on Normandy beaches in June 1944. Obviously, that wasn't going to get through. I don't know whereabouts it was marked with tour à l'envoyer. It may have been Le Havre. It may not have left Le Havre at all. It may have been processed there and returned to sender, or it may have been somewhere in between. But I guess it wouldn't have got terribly far on its westward journey along the invasion beaches. Less known than the D-Day landings were the landings in the south of France, which happened slightly later in August 1944, Operation Dragoon, from Northern Africa, Free French, British and US forces came into the south of France. But the main thrust was carried out by the French First Army, the Free French First Army. Which is perhaps why we know so little about it. Anyway, it caused absolute chaos in the south. It drove the occupying Germans north into the middle of France and disrupted the postal service, particularly important in that it disrupted the postal service at Lyon, because the route into Germany, whether it was civilian mail, as with these examples, or prisoner of war mail, or the French workers in Germany, any mail into Germany went, the route was you went down to Lyon, across to Frankfurt, and then it was dispersed into Germany. So with the Germans having left Lyon, the route collapsed, and this civilian mail couldn't be delivered, and there are interesting suggestions in the form of hand stamps. Retour à l'envoyeur, return, it can't be sent. It says try the Red Cross system. Difficult to read, I know. Employee formule de la Croix Rouge. And this is an example of a prisoner of war card, which, as I say, would have gone down through Lyon or Frankfurt and across that way, trying to use the Red Cross. It's endorsed Croix Rouge de Genève, and it seems to have worked because it actually got there. There is the camp censor cachet on its arrival. This is December 1944. The bottom, the second item is far more unusual. Well, in fact, the Red Cross endorsement is uncommon, but the second one is endorsed care of the General Post Office via Grand Britannia. There was a rumor that there was a postal service run from London to which French prisoners of war could send their mail, and then it would be dispersed in France itself. I can't imagine how they thought that would work. It wasn't official, it was a rumor. Nevertheless, you do get these cards with that endorsement. They didn't go through London. They were probably held by the French post office, but they did, well, in this case anyway, it did certainly get to its destination because it was censored on arrival at the Stalag 3D. It's interesting because it's the only example I've seen of one of these cards from France into Germany. I've got half a dozen others from Germany into France, but this is the only one going in that direction. It caused a ruckus with the British Post Office. They didn't like this stuff arriving on their doorstep. They couldn't do anything with it, and complained to the French Post Office, which actually issued an official bulletin saying to postmasters, do not forward mail by this route, it does not exist. Interesting nonetheless. So that's the end of the display, folks. Thanks for your attention. I hope you found something of interest in what is a vast subject. This is just scratching the surface, but it's something that keeps me off the streets, as it were. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Really interesting. And the good news is that we've got a question for you.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. The right, something popped up on my screen there. Sorry. Yes. Now we have a question for you from Nick Harvey, who asked. Oh, in fact, a couple of questions. Sorry. Right. Nick Harvey asks, did French civilian workers work in the 5 U-boat ports? And if so, were they put in camps?
I haven't come across anything from the U-boats, specifically, other than that item from the Gdynia docks, which was a submarine service dockyard. So he was obviously allowed to work on the subs, but I don't know whether he got any closer than that, I'm afraid.
Okay,
Mm.
thank you. And Grace Davis was just asking about this business where you said someone was working in a place where they were making fountain pens. She said, were fountain pens flippant? Weren't biros around at that point? Did we have biros then?
I don't know, but I mean, this was obviously sort of luxury end writing implements.
Yes.
And anybody in a company, a manufacturer, any kind of company in Germany could apply for labour. In fact, you could apply for it for servants, in fact. And I have a letter to one lady who was a housemaid, a French housemaid employed by a grand family in Germany. But yes, I suppose, you know, the guy wanted to keep his business going during the war, selling high-end fountain pens.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm thinking, if I may come in, Mark, is that if there were no biros then, fountain pens were the alternative to pencil, which was so permanent. So they were quite, I mean, isn't it relevant to know if there were biros? Because otherwise they were important, weren't they? Pens? Maybe not. That's why I picked up on it.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, when were biros invented? I know they were around in the late 40s. I don't know.
I think it was
that
1938.
Okay.
I was going to say the Americans invented them, I think, for use in airplanes, didn't they? To stop the ink running.
Interesting.
Because the pressure on the fountain pens made the ink all come out if they were at high altitude. I think that is right, but don't quote me.
Biro was a Hungarian, but biros were first sold, according to Mr. Google, in 1945 in the United States. So there were no biros in the Second World War.
Oh,
right.
Okay. All right.
Apologies.
So they were an important writing implement, which I think is Grace's point. Yeah. Excellent. Good. Well, those were the only 2 questions that I've seen. So I think I'd like to say thank you, Paul. I'd like to hand back to Simon at this point.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. I expect there may be a bit more coming up in the chat. And if the alien nuns or the idea of charging a tank with a bayonet didn't interest you, I mean, there were lots of fascinating insights, really, into so many aspects of the war and problems that we in this country never had to encounter. There might have been a more total mobilisation. And rationing might have been a problem, but the problems with the mail are many and varied. And actually, it was complete news to me that the difficulty of communicating between the 2 halves of the country once Vichy was occupied, all kinds of implications for the colonies around the world, those that were Vichy and those that weren't, and when they changed over. So absolutely fascinating, and I can see there are all kinds of byways there one could explore. So it's been most entertaining. Thank you very much for it. Thank everybody for attending. And Mark, I believe we have a certificate to present to Paul. Right, there you go. A certificate of appreciation signed by the president, no less.
Excellent. Thank you.
So that will be on its way to you, and thank you very much. And I suggest, Mark, perhaps we close the formal part of the meeting then and revert to the informal. And any of those questions you were too embarrassed to put into the chat, you can fire away at. And as we've seen with the biros, there'll be somebody who knows the answer.
Yes.